Well, I think we're just about on time to move forward to our next speaker. Let me just start the slideshow. So there we go. So this is, of course, David that will be giving us our next presentation. So I'll give you a little bit of background for those who do not know David that well yet. David teaches painting, drawing and colour at the National Art School in Sydney and drawing at the University of Technology, also in Sydney. He has taught classes on colour for painters for more than 20 years, including theories of colour, a Bachelor of Fine Arts lecturer on the theory and practice of colour at the National Art School in 2009 to 2011, and Understanding and Applying Colour, a National Art School public program short course available online since 2020. David is the author of a major website on modern colour theory for painters, which is, of course, where that extract is from that I'm showing you on the screen. It's called The Dimensions of Colour, and it's been available since 2007. And his publications include a chapter, Colour Spaces, in the Rutledge Handbook of Philosophy of Colour 2020. David is currently the national president of the Colour Society and also the New South Wales Divisional Chair. And he's also co-chair of the AIC study group on art and design. And I have to say that what I do know about colour, I've learned from David, and what I've forgotten is all my own fault. But in any case, I very much look forward to his presentation of the dimensions of colour today. So I'll stop sharing my screen and pass straight over to David.
Well, thanks very much, John, and hello everyone. A limitation of a lot of colour education in art and design today is in its treatment of the attributes or dimensions of colour. Colour is often considered in isolation from lightness or tone and presented in terms of a single two-dimensional hue circle or colour wheel, very often in a form embodying historical beliefs about three primary colours. Even when colour is considered three-dimensionally, it's usually with the assumption that a single set of three colour attributes suffices for all purposes and for all modes of colour appearance, and that these three attributes can be adequately represented by a simple symmetrical model like a sphere. It's been nearly 15 years since I first addressed these issues in my website, The Dimensions of Colour. And in this talk I'll give an overview of the main alternative frameworks available to painters today for visualizing colour relationships and highlight some positive developments stemming from a number of sources that have emerged over this period. For painters using physical media, the most widely used three-dimensional framework is the Munsel System, which classifies colours of paints and other physical objects in terms of the colour attributes of hue, lightness, called value in the Munsel System, and chroma, or strength of colour. What we're seeing here is the range or gamut of paint colours that can be obtained from mixtures of a particular set of acrylic paints. When we look at what we might call the individual hue pages, we can see that the colours reach their maximum chroma at different values for different hues, forming an irregular solid that can't be reduced to a regular sphere without either distorting the chroma dimension or leaving out many paint mixtures. Painters learn to think of paint mixtures as following paths through this colour space, and it's essential for them to understand that the space is irregular and varies with different sets of paints. An example of a useful procedure for using this framework is to match a target colour in paint by selecting paints either side of the target colour in hue, and then to raise or lower them to the value of the target colour before mixing these to obtain the required hue, and then, if necessary, reducing the chroma by adding a neutral grey paint of the same value. These examples have been screenshots obtained using Zsolt Kovacs-Vajna's program Drop to Color, which generates 3D plots of paint mixing paths and gamuts in Munsell space. This free program became publicly available not long after the launch of Dimensions of Color, and is a wonderful resource for helping students to visualize mixtures of paints as following paths through hue value chroma space. This short movie will give you a feel for the three-dimensional output of the program. However, all young art and design students today also need to understand digital color, and while Munsell notations can be converted to and from digital color specifications, this is only by going through a table rather than directly through a formula. For digital painters and in the digital environment generally, it's more convenient to use the color space CLab, known as lab space in Photoshop. CLab was designed to arrange digital colors similarly to the Munsel system, although it specifies them in terms of reddish versus greenish and yellowish versus bluish chroma components A star and B star, instead of hue and overall chroma. Another very useful tool for explaining color is Color Inspector 3D, which can be used to display colors from a photograph in CLab and other color spaces. It's actually been around since 2004, although I only came across it a few years ago. Again, this short movie will give you a feeling for the three-dimensional output of the program and how it can be used to help students to visualize paint mixing paths in hue value chroma space. So for example, we can compare the gamut or range of mixtures obtained from different sets of paints. And here we see plotted the changes in hue and chroma as well as value when we add white paint to two different colorant paints. And here we see the mixing path of two paints of different hues but similar values, showing the typical drop-in value that you may have noticed earlier in many of the mixing paths in Drop to Color. So, lightness and chroma provide one way to classify colors of objects including paints, and to divide up a hue page of colors like this, where lightness increases going up the page and chroma increases to the right. But there's another way we can think of variations of color on this page. We can consider these colors to be perceptually made up of black, white, and pure color components. So towards the top corner, the colors are perceived to have a high white component. Towards the bottom corner, they're perceived to have a high black component. And towards the right corner, they're perceived to have a high colored component. This is the basis of the Scandinavian Natural Colour System, or NCS, in which these components are assigned numbers taken to add up to 100. Colours are specified in the NCS according to their perceived black content, called blackness, and their perceived colour content, called chromaticness, or in standard CIE terms, chroma, relative to the maximum chroma possible for the hue. If we were to arrange the triangles for every hue around a central axis, we'd get a symmetrical colour space in the form of a double cone. But as you can see, the actual coloured chips do not fill the triangles and occupy different parts of the triangle for different hues, so that like the Munsell system, the range of actual paint chips in the NCS forms an irregular solid. Something that can be of great interest to us as painters is what happens when we cross that upper line of zero blackness. If we were to take any chip and increase the amount of light that it reflects or emits without changing its spectral composition, the colours we perceive would move along a straight line radiating from the black point, like the blue line here. Blackness would decrease to 0 at the upper line, and then the chip would begin to appear fluorescent, that is, to show the appearance of physical fluorescence, the appearance of being unnaturally bright, before reaching the appearance of luminosity, the appearance of a light-emitting object. This sequence of states of appearance, passing from black through decreasing blackness to 0 blackness, followed by fluorescence and then luminosity, is called brilliance. In this demonstration from my paper at AIC 2021 in Milan, I'm going to progressively increase the amount of light the circular area on the right side of the cube emits relative to its surrounds. With little or no light emitted, the area is perceived to be black. At this level, the area appears brown, a colour exhibiting a certain degree of blackness. At this level, the area appears to be a bright orange of approximately 0 blackness. That is, it exhibits neither blackness nor fluorescence. Now, if I increase the light further, I get this unnaturally bright or fluorescent appearance called fluorescence. Interestingly, the circle on the top face is depicted with exactly the same RGB colour, but does not appear fluorescent in this context, seen as being more brightly lit. I can't turn up the orange light any further, so to show you the next step I need to evoke a more dimly lit context. And now the same RGB colour gives the appearance of a primary light source. Understanding these relationships can obviously be very helpful for painters if they are concerned with creating the appearance of luminosity and consistent illumination. The NCS has published a translation key of NCS notations for Munsell chips when viewed on a light background, and it's possible to use these tables to draw in contours of equal NCS blackness on Munsell Hue pages, as I've done here. These pages show that the point of 0 blackness lies close above the top of the Munsell solid, near or just above the lightest chips of each hue and chroma. We can see that the point of 0 blackness occurs at different Munsell values, depending on the hue and chroma. 0 blackness and the transition to fluorescence occur at high values for all pale colours, and lower values for strong colours, at the lowest values for strong blues and violets, and moderate values for strong reds and greens, and light values for strong yellows. This concept is vital to fully understanding colour relationships on hue pages like these. The Munsell system is designed so that chips of the same Munsell value reflect light of the same luminance under a standard daylight illuminant, where luminance is a measure of energy of light from the point of view of the human visual system that factors in the very different responsiveness of this system to light of different wavelengths. This corresponding diagram in CLab shows the gamut of digital colours rather than physical paint chips, and has a middle grey rather than a light background. These two factors mean that the highest chroma swatches begin to encroach into fluorescent territory. They have a bit of a glowing look about them. As in the Munsell system, all swatches in the same horizontal row emit light of the same luminance. But as we pass outwards along this row from the grey axis, the brilliance or freedom from blackness increases, and the glowing look of the highest chroma swatches might lead untrained observers to estimate them to be higher in lightness than 50, perhaps 60 or 70. There's a view that this is a fault in Munsell value and CIE lightness as measures of perceived lightness, but I would say that two distinct perceptions are being confused here. There is a perception of luminance-related lightness that shows up as distinctness of boundary, Note that in the value 60 row, all of the swatches have similarly distinct boundaries with the value 50 grey background. And in the value 50 row, all of the chips display very indistinct brightness contrast with the background, despite the fact that some of the chips have a glowing appearance. It may help to place a value 60 grey swatch adjacent to the glowing red swatches. I hope you'll agree that when we examine the border between the grey and red swatches, the grey swatch is the lighter of the two, even though the latter appears glowing. So I think there really are two perceptions here: luminance-related lightness and this glowing impression associated with high brilliance. So I hope I've convinced you that to know your way around a hue page, it's useful to understand how it can be divided up according to blackness or brilliance, as well as according to lightness. In teaching painters, I would start with the lightness-based systems, Munsell and C-Lab, because of the enormous importance of lightness for painters of all kinds. But the important thing is that both approaches should be understood before too long. A great resource for the Munsel system is the hue page sorting exercise included in the new Munsell student colour set. And Steve Westland of the Colour Literacy Project has created interactive online versions of this exercise that allow you to drag and sort virtual colour chips on a hue page. The NCS has produced chip sorting exercises illustrating the concepts of white, black and chromatic content, and Paul Green-Armitage and Maggie Maggio have devised chip sets designed on a similar basis intended for young children for the Colour Literacy Project. So lightness and blackness provide two different ways of dividing up a hue page of colours of paints and other objects, but neither are applicable to colours of light, such as light perceived as coming from a primary light source. I'm hoping you'll perceive the black panel in the middle of this illustration as having an array of 9 luminous dots. If so, you'll see that when we're thinking of these dots as light sources, we can't describe them in terms of lightness or blackness. They're off the scale of lightness and off the scale of blackness. So we need another set of terms to describe colours of lights. One way we could describe them would be to say that the 3 on the left are pure white light, varying only in brightness. The 3 on the right are all pure orange lights, varying only in brightness, and the 3 in the middle all exhibit a similar balance of white and orange light components, varying only in brightness. This perceived proportion of coloured light component, or freedom from a white light component of a light, is called saturation. Now, since the brightest white light is brighter than the brightest whitish-orange light, and the brightest whitish-orange light is brighter than the brightest saturated orange light, we could classify the 9 lights in terms of brightness and saturation like this. But you may notice that the middle and right-hand series of lights become more colourful as they get brighter. Their strength of colour increases. So another way we could classify these lights is according to brightness and colourfulness, like this. The saturation or purity of colour of the lights is now shown as the angle between the series and the vertical axis. These terms brightness, saturation and colourfulness also apply to the colours of light reflected to our eyes from different areas of a scene, and so can be used to describe the appearance of a scene. For example, we might say that the lighter coloured areas of the floor appear to have the same high lightness, that is, to be white things, but to vary greatly in brightness, the amount of light they are perceived to send to the eye. The lines of uniform saturation turn out to be important in that the light reflected to the eye by an opaque, uniformly coloured object under different levels of illumination would be expected to follow these lines in the simplest instance. For example, our 3 saturated orange lights correspond to the light reflected to our eyes from the left, right and top planes of this orange cube. And our 3 less saturated orange lights correspond to the light reflected to our eyes from the same planes of this cube. To paint the appearance of this scene, we would in some way translate these differences in brightness and colorfulness into differences of lightness and chroma of our paints. The attributes of brightness and saturation help us to properly understand a very widely used digital color space, HSB, which considers the colors of pixels as colors of lights. S is a simple index intended to predict the saturation of the digital color relative to the maximum saturation possible for that hue. And B is intended to predict the brightness of the color relative to the maximum brightness possible for digital colors of that hue and saturation. And on its right-hand side, the Adobe Photoshop Color Picker also provides an alternative way of specifying colors of pixels as object colors having lightness using lab space. Blackness-based specifications are not as readily available in the digital realm at present, but a complete set of NCS colors can be downloaded as a free swatch file from the NCS website, and a color space specifying digital colors in terms of relative whiteness and relative blackness has recently become available in CSS. Just as different three-dimensional color frameworks are useful for different purposes, different hue circles may also be needed for different purposes. A minority of painters refer to a physical color atlas, usually the Munsell Book of Color, to specify paint hues, but many more make use of one or more hue circles as a conceptual framework. I'll briefly outline the main hue circles that painters today think in terms of. The Munsell Hue Circle is structured around 5 opposite pairs of hues, so it's a bit more complicated to learn than the 3 opposite pairs of many popular colour wheels, but it does have the advantage of being perceptually even and of showing to a very good approximation additive or visual complementaries, for example showing red opposite turquoise or blue-green and green opposite magenta or red-purple. When a simpler conceptual framework is all that's required, a basic hue circle structured around the unique hues arranged in opponent pairs of yellow opposite blue and red opposite green may suffice. Neither the precise hues deemed to be elementary, red, yellow, green and blue in the NCS, nor the slightly different hues conventionally regarded as middle red, yellow, green and blue by painters are evenly spaced perceptually, but this may not be a significant drawback for many purposes. The appeal of the traditional red, yellow and blue primary colours is understandable in the context of the concept of unique hues, which holds that red, yellow and blue, along with green, are perceived to be the pure components that combine to form intermediate hue perceptions. As I argued last year in my presentation for colour connections, the omission of green from the traditional primary colours can be seen as a relic of the view that prevailed before we understood subtractive mixture, when the colour green was thought to be physically composed of yellow and blue. Omitting green and placing middle red, yellow and blue at equal distances results in a hue circle that is perceptually very uneven and in which some of the opposing hues are far from visual complementaries. Despite these drawbacks, some very skilled painters continue to favour the traditional colour wheel as a simple practical framework, although one suspects that an equally simple but less problematic framework might serve their purposes even better. The most unfortunate aspect of the continued use of the red-yellow-blue framework is that it encourages misconceptions about colour itself. It can take considerable effort to dislodge from a student's mind the idea that a greenish yellow contains some blue, or a greenish blue contains some yellow, once it's in there. If we replace the middle red and middle blue of the traditional colour wheel with magenta and cyan respectively, we can obtain a hue circle that is less distorted in perceptual spacing and in complementary relationships. Further to this, a cyan, magenta and yellow palette has a larger and more even gamut than other sets of colorant paints, including the three traditional primaries, red, yellow and blue. But what's more important is the reason why this is so. A distinct difference in the pattern of mixing paths for paints close to cyan, magenta and yellow hues compared to paints distant from these hues. You'll notice that these red paints make high chroma mixtures only with paints that are quite close in hue, and that they're neutralized by paints of quite a wide range of opposing hues. But now as we see these yellow paints, we're seeing that we get quite high chroma mixtures with paints that are quite distant in hue, and paints of only a very narrow range of hues are directly neutralizing the paint. And now with these yellow-green paints, we're getting high chroma mixtures only, once again, with fairly close paints that are fairly close in hue, and we're being more or less directly neutralized by paints of a pretty wide range of opposing hues. Now with this cyan paint, we get a similar pattern to what we saw with yellow, with high chroma mixtures with paints that are quite distant in hue, and only a narrow range of hues of paints that directly neutralize the cyan. Now when we get to the violet blue and violet paints, again the pattern like the red and the yellowish green of only making high chroma mixtures with paints quite close in hue and being neutralized by a pretty wide range of hues of paints. And then with magenta, when we're close to magenta in hue, the similar pattern to what we saw with the yellow and the cyan, high chroma mixtures with paints that are distant in hue, and not being directly neutralized except in a very narrow range of hues. So sure, a consequence of these patterns is that if we pick paint that's close to each of the hues, cyan, magenta and yellow, we're going to get a larger gamut, a more even gamut than we could get if we pick paints that are far from those hues. But at least as important as that is to understand that the effect of proximity to those hues is going to have on the mixing paths we can expect from our paints. In most graphics programs, hue is measured by hue angle in HSB color space, which is a very perceptually uneven scale in that the same angular change corresponds to a much smaller hue change in some sectors, especially the green and blue sectors, than others. Opposite hues are complementary on the 0, 180, 6240 and 120, 300 degree axes, but not on intermediate axes, as I've explained in Dimensions of Colour. Although CLAB was designed to specify colours in terms of A star and B star chromatic components, these can readily be converted to predictors of chroma and hue angle in the format L star C star H. This measure of hue angle is much better than a hue angle in HSB, but so far is not widely available in graphics programs, apart from the open source program GIMP. Many painters using traditional media, especially watercolours, have become familiar with specification of paint colours in terms of CLAB and the colour appearance model CCAM02 through the very impressive and highly influential handprint website of Bruce MacEvoy, created in 1998 and continually extended since then. I'd like to finish by emphasising the positive developments I've seen since I posted the first pages of Dimensions of Colour in 2007. About the same time, Graydon Parrish and others created the Rational Painting Forum, which not only brought together numerous skilled exponents of the Munsel system as applied to painting, but was also a home for high-level discussion and exchange of information about all aspects of our current understanding of colour. Graydon Parrish, Richard Murdock and other former contributors to Rational Painting, notably including Douglas Flint and Paul Foxton, have gone on to contribute very positively to the understanding of colour among painters through their live and online painting classes, their blogs and Facebook groups, and or their online videos. There's also James Gurney's excellent book Colour and Light from 2010, which deservedly has a very strong reputation among young students of painting. The book provides an excellent introduction to a broad range of topics including different hue circles, physical aspects of lighting, visual perception for artists and much more. I can't think of a more positive note to end on than the work of Peter Donoghue, who posts on TikTok as colour.nerd. In a short time he's attracted a huge following with his entertaining and well-researched posts on modern colour theory for painters. The thing I love about Peter is that I'm sure people tell him that things like macadam ellipses are too advanced for a general audience, but he just goes ahead and makes a video about them and gets 25,000 views. I think it's fair to say that it's become harder today for people to teach the old traditional red, yellow, blue colour theory without someone in the class or in the comments section challenging them based on these newer sources of information. I remain unsure to what extent modern colour theory will replace traditional colour theory in formal education. At the moment it seems more that the old colour courses are simply dying out and students are increasingly getting their information from other sources. Of course, not all other sources are as well researched as Gurney and Donoghue, far from it. So one thing we can do in the Colour Literacy Project is to help students to find the best sources. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, David. I think judging by the responses in the chat, everyone would be keen to see your full presentation. I think given the time constraints and the fact that, as almost all of us know, David is very available online and tends to be very generous in responding to queries. I should also listed 1,000 questions. But I think, look, thanks very much, David, on all our behalf. And